All right, well, we can get started. Thank you all for coming to the best panel of the day. It's right here, right now, scoping the future of water investments in Arizona. But for those of you who are not from Arizona and may not have a lot of interest in Arizona, do not fear. The conversation that we're going to have today probably translates to a number of different places in the United States and even internationally. So, but we are kind of thinking as Arizona as kind of ground zero. So my name is Cynthia Campbell. I am a director of policy innovation at the Arizona Water Innovation Initiative here at ASU. It's part of the Global Futures Laboratory. And I'm joined by a panel of experts on water financing of infrastructure. And so I'm going to give them an opportunity to talk about each of what they do a little bit and talk about some really good things about water financing. But I want to frame up very quickly Arizona's situation right now. Arizona is in a place right now, probably at a moment of inflection, where we are seeing water resource portfolios that are becoming constrained. I'm sure you're all aware of the Colorado River issues, as well as groundwater issues here locally. At the same time that's happening, we have had an advent of high-tech manufacturing and other types of water users that are of a scale in terms of the size and scope of how much water that they use that we really have not seen here in the Phoenix metro area or the Tucson area either. So those things are converging at the same time. In addition, we have what we've always used in terms of traditional infrastructure financing, if you think of municipal bonds, reclamation cost shares, federal grants, those types of things. That type of traditional water infrastructure financing is really not quite up to the task maybe for what we might need, because what we need really is to increase our efficiency. We need water augmentation. We need to optimize our available resources. So there's a large scale of what we might need here in Arizona. And it looks like traditional funds might not be up to the task or might be lagging in the time frame. So we think this is a problem that might be happening in other places or will happen in other places. And we think that that makes this conversation very relevant. So with that, I'm going to turn to our panelists and give them an opportunity to briefly introduce themselves and just tell you what they do in this water financing space, and then we'll get to some good questions. Hank, I'm gonna turn to you first.
Hank, you don't have to go first if you don't want to.
I'll go. Yeah. Thanks, Cynthia. So I thought about starting. I'm from Texas, and I'm here to help. But I figured that wouldn't play well, but I will bring greetings from Texas because I'm from Dallas, and I'm Hank Habak, the managing co-founder of the Water Finance Exchange. And I was excited about this because I'm learning a lot about Arizona, and really, as you can probably guess, Arizona and Texas really are kindred spirits in many ways. We share a lot of the same characteristics. We've got growing population, a lot of smart people, a lot of capital, a lot of industry that wants to grow here, and we've got significant water scarcity issues. And I know in Texas, and I think it's true here, even people who didn't pay much attention to water now realize that the biggest single brake on economic growth is water infrastructure, is water supply and water infrastructure. So I think there's some communities of interest between those states, but also with other states as well. So Water Finance Exchange, we're a nonprofit intermediary that works with primarily smaller communities, the ones that have not been in the water financing system historically, the ones whose infrastructure are falling apart, but the ones who are critically located in regions where water infrastructure is challenged. And our guiding premise, and I've been in the water space for 45 years. I won't take any time with the sordid history other than to say that one thing that's an article of faith for me is that affordable, sustainable water infrastructure is essential to the prosperity and health of any region, of any community or any region. And affordable water infrastructure, sustainable water infrastructure is not possible without affordable capital. You just can't get there without affordable capital. So somehow water infrastructure wherever it is, including the tens of thousands of smaller communities. They're not big cities that get a lot of SRF money, have to be covered. So our work has three basic prongs, and then we can get into this as we get into the discussion. The first one is basic technical assistance. The one thing that's critical to financing any entity is technical assistance. So what we look at these communities, many of which don't have audited financials, they don't have a CFO, and help them build financing capacity so that they can be eligible for financing, because even though we'd like to have all grants, you're going to need grants and loans no matter what. Second, we have an obsessive focus on finance. So connecting when communities get through technical assistance and have the financial capacity to take on loans and to do financings, we match them with sources of capital, and not just government sources of capital, but private and philanthropic sources of capital as well. And third, but not least, is we focus on building scale, because there's, again, tens of thousands of smaller communities. We want to build scale, and we think the theater for building scale and for really, building investment is the region. In a region, the communities and people who live in a region that share similar kinds of economic interests, resiliency problems, supply problems, and so forth. And so the region is the key theater, and there's a lot. And so, in less than 5 years, we are working with 200 communities. We've helped them raise over $320 million, and these are small, underserved communities. And we have about 20 significant regional projects going on, which I'll be happy to tell you about, but I'll stop there.
Well, thanks, Cynthia. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. My name is Chelsea McGuire, and I am the director of the Water Infrastructure Finance Authority of Arizona. We are the main provider of that affordable, accessible capital that Hank was talking about that's so critical for water systems across the state. WIFA is easiest described as a bank. We're a state-run bank, so we utilize public money to provide low-cost financing, including grants and loans and kind of everything in between for water infrastructure across the state. They've actually been around since 1990 or thereabouts. Most people think of us in our kind of new genesis in 2022, but this work we've done since 1990 is really critical. We've put about $3 billion on the ground for infrastructure for more than 300 projects across the state. And those are in communities large and small, private and public water providers. It's definitely an all-comers, the kind of capital that we need to build the resilient infrastructure that's made Arizona into the state that it is today. But we manage actually 5 funds. So we have our 2 state revolving funds, the Clean and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds. We have a Water Conservation Grant Fund, which to date has put about $212 million on the ground for water conservation projects, saving about 6 million acre-feet of water, somewhere about. So absolutely something we're very proud of. We also have a rurally focused water supply development revolving fund. This is one of our newer funds. Right now we have about $83 million allocated from that fund, 60 million of it in grants, the rest of it in very low interest loans to help specifically rural communities build the infrastructure that they need. And then we have sort of our big headline grabber, and that's the Long-Term Water Augmentation Fund. And just as the name implies, the purpose of that fund is to find the capital, but also the off-takers, the financing, the operators, the maintainers, kind of all of the above of big water importation projects. Now, some of you are not from Arizona, some of you are, but even if you're not, you probably haven't noticed a whole lot of extra water floating around us right now. So those water importation projects are going to need to be built somewhere that's not Arizona. And that puts us in a really unique position to say, how do we do that? How do we go build those partnerships? And that's what WIFA was created to do. We just concluded a nationwide and international, actually, solicitation for these kinds of cross-jurisdictional regional water augmentation projects. It was highly successful. We have identified 2 unique private sector development teams that have 7 different water augmentation projects that we're currently undergoing further appraisal studies to determine which of those, or combination of those, is going to be the right mix to bring that next big new renewable source of water into Arizona. So I'm excited to talk today about how we kind of put the private and public sector together, how WIFA acts as kind of a matchmaker in that industry, and hopefully tries to fill some of the gaps that I think we'll hear about and talk about with the other panelists.
Air, you're up.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm Eric Copeland. I'm the executive director of Blue Commons. And like WIFA, we are more or less a bank, a community blue bank. And we design and deploy catalytic capital that really supports projects in and around the Colorado River Basin. And we take, proven water solutions and really turn them into investable opportunities. And I kind of liken it to water first, capital that flows, community that knows. So we're all about community. And so we accelerate upfront advanced cost for early project development. Then we scale and customize innovative financing that really leverages public funding, and then we recycle those funds back into those projects for improvement and advancement. So it's a cool company. What can I say? I love it. The team is back there. And yeah, I'm excited to be part of the panel.
All right, that leaves us John.
Thanks, Cynthia. John Take. I live in Tucson, Arizona, and I'm Stantec's Chief Growth and Innovation Officer. Stantec is about 35,000 engineers and architects and scientists that are working on some really gnarly challenges around resilient infrastructure, around climate solutions, communities and infrastructure of the future, and working on resource security as well, which one of my favorite resources is water. And so we're a full service architecture, engineering, and science company. We've done over 250 public-private partnerships. 40 of them are in the water space. So we've recognized that a big part of sustainability is financial sustainability, and been working really hard to put those partnerships together that can help deliver public-private partnerships. So we're honored to be one of the team that's working on 3 of Chelsea's 7 concepts. So we're working and really excited to have the opportunity, the honor to work on the evaluation of those concepts for Arizona as part of a bigger community discussion.
Awesome. All right, and so I'm going to start first a little bit trying to frame up a little. Chelsea kind of gave us the marquee version of, big infrastructure in terms of water augmentation. But Air, I'm going to turn to you and ask you a question about, what are some examples of these types of water-related investments that could actually benefit Arizona that might not be like the large-scale augmentation?
Yeah, and I actually think it's more important to not think so much about the massive nature of the water problem, but thinking more locally with the problems in our communities. And I think obviously we have agricultural irrigation needs, especially with farmers and tribal communities. I think that's really vital to think about how we invest in them. And at Blue Commons, we've done a lot of that work already. I also think that, I got to tell you, I'm in California, but I came here and this week has been super crazy hot. And it made me think about how important it is to build programs around tree equity and, making sure that there's enough shade in these areas, especially in local communities and underserved communities. So there's a lot of related projects that I think can come to pass in that capacity. Obviously, restoration is critical. Watershed management is critical. Wastewater reuse is critical. Those are known things. And I will say, and I know this has been talked about in a lot of different ways on other panels so far, but this data center build out is such a aggressive thing right now to come into the Arizona landscape. And, from an environmental standpoint, at least from a reputation perspective, a lot of those data centers are looked upon like, oh, they're coming in here to invade our area. So it's critical that, we all partner with, these data centers and corporations and in the private sector to make sure that we mitigate some of that reputational issues that they're having for community. I think that's really, really important. So I think it's not one, it's all of them that we need to be thinking about investing in. I think the most important thing, period, is integration, working together. We cannot work in silos anymore. The water problem is such a crisis. And if we had any sort of crisis, like if you had a health crisis, you would go to the hospital, there would be a entire team working on you, working together to get you up to baseline health so that you can restore your health for the long term. That's what needs to happen here as well in the footprint of Arizona and beyond. And I will say lastly, I think Arizona can be a microcosm for an amazing model of what can become for water sustainability and resiliency across the world. If all the parties come together, I think it can really set the tone in a very unique way.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. Let me ask Hank, we're talking about a large scale of different types of water infrastructure projects that I think we framed up that we need, both here in Arizona and other places. But let's turn a little bit to the financing aspect of it. What are some maybe slightly more innovative ways to finance water infrastructure than we've seen in the traditional kind of local government or federal match kind of funding scenarios?
Yeah, thanks. There are a lot of ideas. I just want to underscore what Air said, that it all has to start at the local level because, well, communities are not homogenous, and you need to understand both the human and the technical aspects of communities. But it's important to widen your aperture to the region in which the community is located very quickly. And even if you don't do a regional project, by getting the stakeholders together and gathering whatever knowledge you have, and I know there's a lot of knowledge here about the natural situation, the resource situation, and what are the other economic kinds of economic development issues in the region, it helps you develop a plan that makes sense, and it helps attract more capital because they see there's forward movement. It isn't just what the stereotype of a stagnant rural area where people leave high school and move out of town and there's no growth. You need to have some sense. It doesn't have to be breakneck growth, but that's really important. So that's a premise which I think is really important. Sometimes there isn't a lightning bolt from Mount Olympus that's going to come down with a brilliant financial structure that's going to solve all of this. But to answer your questions, sorry for the preface there, it is blended financing. And when I say blended financing, there are three primary sources. It's government money, which is primarily state revolving funds, but not just state revolving funds. There's Department of Agriculture. I saw Interior, and I know this is more Bureau of Reclamation, but Interior just announced a $900 million fund for water in the West, water conveyances in the West. So there's lots of different sources of government money you need to track. And there's philanthropic money, which can be like what Blue Commons is doing, be catalytic capital, like guarantees and those kinds of things that can take smaller communities that seem like there's significant credit risks and remove the credit risk so that they can actually get financing in the private capital markets. And then there is the private capital markets. There's both private banks, which ought to be interested in communities because municipalities are really good credit risks once you know that they have a good management system for their water infrastructure. But then there are also, I think, industry, and I think Air was implying this, that there are two kinds of industrial interests here. One are the industries that want to move into an area. And historically, the idea was you'd compete for industry by giving them breaks on their utility costs and things like that. No, when an industry wants to come in, they need to become partners, and they need to become investors along with the community. And I think that's happening more and more. So I'll just cite one example, if that's okay. And then, because it's ironic that Henry Cheruby earlier today talked about a brackish desal project in South Texas. Well, we're working with the communities in South Texas. There's an area called South Texas Water Authority, which is 9 communities. We've been working them to raise $70 million, and then Henry's company is going to do brackish desal because their big issue is water supply, and they needed to work together to procure the water supply, and then develop a governance structure that allows them to not all be joined at the hip, but to collaborate on issues where it makes sense to collaborate. And so there you have Texas Water Development Board money. There's some philanthropic money. There's Henry's company's money. And then there's other private capital that's making this whole thing come together. I hope that helps.
No, that definitely helps. So picking up on that same idea, it sounds like, collaboration in terms of trying to bring in private financing. John, I'm going to ask you, what do you think makes a project, a public project like that, attractive to a private investor?
So I think, you start with that common cause. And so, those water investments that are going to pencil out always, they have that strong common cause that you've been able to identify. And increasingly, we're seeing a very diverse set of partners that would come alongside a certain project. They've found that common cause, despite some incredible differences sometimes. It can be an Indigenous community and a large industrial concern. They find that common cause. And so it comes down eventually to feasibility. And it's not just technical feasibility, which is often the easy part. Is there community buy-in? Is there social license, regulatory-wise, legal framework-wise? Is this going to work across all of the different vectors that could possibly represent a no-go decision? So, I think there's a robust set of evaluation criteria. Where we get into problems is when we just start picking single criteria that said, well, whatever's the cheapest, we'll pick that and we'll go with it. Or whatever's best, whatever preserves the most potential loss of human life, or whatever is most environmentally beneficial. I think the idea of coming up with a very transparent and a very rigorous and a very very diverse set of criteria in the go no go decision. If we're only worried about, well, what's the cheapest water around, we may end up in some weird places. We've got to have incredibly transparent dialogues about why we would go ahead with certain projects. Which projects should we pick?
So Hank and John, you both identified the possibility of bringing in private investment in a way that maybe we just haven't done as much of that recently. I'm going to turn, Chelsea, and ask you the question. I mean, WIFA's got a pretty big charge at this point, and frankly, not a lot of state money behind it. Is it possible for an entity like WIFA to be in a partnership like this where you start talking about private capital?
I mean, it's not only possible, it's entirely necessary because, as you've said, we don't have a whole lot of state capital. One of the challenges that we have faced is that, one, there's not a lot of state money to go around, and two, legislative attention spans are a little bit shorter than water projects need them to be. And so even when there is that state money, it can be difficult to secure those resources in a way that can actually go to the private sector and private financiers and say, hey, we're serious about this and we want to do this. I think WIFA has done that very effectively. I think we've been creative in some of our tools to say, this is the state resource that we have, and this is what we're doing, and this is what we're going to do. But I think there's a really underutilized opportunity in the public-private partnership sector here for water. When you look at the opportunity for the public sector to invite private industry to come in and build, operate, maintain, and finance a project that is financeable because there's a revenue stream at the end of that. You're selling a product, you're selling water at the end of that. Not only does that attract the kind of private capital that can be bigger in scale and more flexible than public resources maybe ever could, it also eliminates or alleviates a lot of the risk on the public sector. You start to alleviate and you start to mitigate some of the risk of things like cost overruns or maintenance costs or the lack of operational expertise that actually the innovation of the private sector does really, really well. And then the public sector can benefit from that in a way that ultimately our ratepayers and our water users benefit from. WIFA's governance structure and WIFA's mission was very forward-thinking. And what we did was we took the existing P3 legislation in Arizona, which was actually with our Department of Transportation, with ADOT. If any of you have gone to Flagstaff lately, you've seen the fruit of that legislation because we now have a flex lane and we're not all stuck in Anthem, and it's great. But we had that kind of tried and true model. We picked up that legislation, we dropped it into WIFA, and we replaced the word roads with water. And that's what we have. And so we are the first opportunity in Arizona to really come alongside as a state entity and utilize the P3 model. That is our anticipation with the private development teams that we have, is that it will be a P3 project and we can do all of the great risk mitigation tools. We can attract that private financing, we can attract that private capital, That's the kind of outside the box thinking that a lot of people in that space are like, no, P3s aren't all that innovative. They've been around for a long time. Well, yeah, they have, which means we've learned a lot about them, which means we can get even better at them. And now we can put them into a sector where I think that model has been highly underutilized. And WIFA's kind of on the cutting edge of that here in Arizona in terms of that is our financing model. We can use the state resources we have to show that we're serious. We can use the state resources that we have to continue to alleviate the ultimate cost of that water, alleviate risk in the ways that make more sense for the public sector to do. But let's invite the private sector in too.
Well, sounds like a plan, but I guess I have to ask the question, and Air, I'll ask you to start. And please, at any point, if anybody else has any thoughts on any of these questions, please jump in. But what are the barriers, right? What are the barriers that come up frequently when we do start to talk about bringing in public water infrastructure? What barriers do you
strategy and the way that financial vehicles and financial structures work is that there is a very clear, predictable sort of risk perception and evaluation. So vehicle of all of your ducks in a row, because you want to know, like, how do I get my money back? But this isn't about money back. This is this is our most precious resource. How do we get our lives back is the question. And I think more than anything else, it's ensuring that a lot of the projects that we are engaged with have proven, structural elements to them where they can be verified. Verified water benefits, infrastructure like certainties. I think all of that matters, and there should be due diligence. There should be some credibility that needs to be assessed and evaluated in that process. So that's a very key barrier. I think secondly, though, it's really important that, we start to ensure relationship building between communities and the folks that need, especially in the tribal community, because trust is such a key value for our tribal nations. And so part of what we do at Blue Commons is we are really great at building long-term relationships. So that in and of itself creates a value that is very trustworthy for a new investor or potential new investor in the private sector that's like, you know what, I feel comfortable moving in this way. So I think it's a combination of a lot of different things that it's important that we evaluate collectively. And again, it's not just one type of investor. There's also, corporate ESG. There is also philanthropy. All of these potential investors have a shared value, which is water and community. So it's really critical that that common denominator is being shared in a way that all parties see the value of their return.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
So just to build on that, I mean, I think one of the challenges that we have to overcome is that new ideas, if they're new ideas that have been tried before, they tend to devolve into single kind of one-line critiques or characterizations. So public-private partnerships, somebody will pull out privatization, that all of a sudden we're going to lose control over this most precious resource, as opposed to knowing there are multiple ways the private sector can be involved as creditors and partners and things like that. That's really important. And we found that, in Texas with regionalization. For a long time, you talk to communities about regionalization, they say, oh no, they're winners and losers in that. We're going to get screwed, if we go in. You forget the Friday night football thing, their rival high schools. It's, we're going to get screwed, it's not going to be fair. And so, but now the legislature has authorized, regional approaches because they've dealt with those kinds of critiques. So it's about building relationships. And the last point I wanted to make, in terms of, Chelsea's challenges, is that it's up to us to come up with ideas and bring them to the state revolving funds or to the state funds. Because, I talked to friends at EPA, SRF, and they all, most of these funds are under leveraged. They could exert a lot more leverage. They could do a lot more catalytic capital. But they don't want to be the initiators of it. they don't want to just sort of come out and start doing this or start inviting the private sector because of all the potential criticisms we talked about. But if you put a deal together and it's, you know, it's well vetted and you bring it to the state, I think we can get some of these done.
So you're kind of talking about what, you know, what public entities need to do to try to put it together. But John, I'm going to ask you this. We had talked earlier about, you know, on the private investment side, what kind of profile is a private investor looking for from the public entity, especially if the project is going to go beyond a single local entity? I mean, you could look at a city and say, okay, I see what this city's all about. I can see how it deals with its finances. I can deal with that. But what if the project is bigger than that? And you're talking about an entity that does not exist, right? There's no regional authority per se. What do you, if you're a private investment, what do you think they're looking for in terms of that coordination or collaboration on a local level among multiple public users?
So I'm going to start with curiosity and creativity and a lot of flexibility. I think, you know, more and more as we move from having autonomy around our water resources at smaller scales to building that autonomy and that shared investment in and benefit from water resources at larger and larger scales, we're going to run into just that kind of a challenge, in that the best solution is not a local solution. It's a local solution, but it is also, it's an and. It works at the region, it works at the mega regional scale. And so I think the willingness to explore, the willingness to partner. If you're going to invite other people into the tent, you've got to be happy that they're in the tent, and you've got to have that flexibility that the project, you know, maybe it only delivers 80% of what you really want, but between the two entities or the 10 entities that have come together, there's a better overall solution that's at a lower cost and a lower risk, and it can deliver multiple benefits across those multiple criteria I was talking about. So I think it's the willingness to have a dialogue, it's the flexibility, and being comfortable with having other people around the table to sit down and find that common cause that would eventually yield a solution. These are all expensive solutions. We can't replicate them all across the landscape. So I think being willing to dialogue and being open to having new friends.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point there, because I always say it seems like it's the problem that always comes up, regardless of the kind of thing you're talking about, water, always ends up with governance, right? At least on the public side. And so, Chelsea, let me ask you, I mean, you're looking at WIFA, you're looking at having to put together one or more projects that's going to go beyond a single governance structure. How do you deal with that? How do you anticipate having to work with multiple governance structures together?
Yeah. I think John makes a really good point in that all of the conversation we've had, I think up to this point, assumes that our local water providers, our municipal water providers, the folks who are going to get this water to the end users are just like ready to jump in and go. And that it might be true of some of them, but it's not always true of some of them. And that's completely understandable, right? Because just as we're talking about, private industry is looking at risk, and they're looking at reward, and they're looking at how do we put these things together. That's what the public sector is looking at too. That's what your local water provider is not going to be super keen to go to city council and say, I've got this great idea and it's only going to cost us $4.5 million and I don't actually know how much water we're going to get from it. You ready to go? Let's go. And so
I'm going in with a whole bunch of other people.
Exactly.
Some of whom you might not like.
Some of whom we've openly said we don't like. So I really see there being a need for, this is not the right term to use in a group of folks who are venture capitalists and tech people, but there's a need for a third-party validator, right? There's a need for somebody to step in that can speak the language of the private sector and say, I have demand here. I have off-takers. I know how we can aggregate them. I know how we can work with them. I can get them in the room under either a single governance structure or an innovative mix of governance structures to make the demand for your project, to make the demand for this work. And then we have to have somebody who can go to the public sector and water providers and say, I understand that this is private and that that's a little bit weird and that that's kind of hard to sell and that you're not used to doing this. And it's a lot easier for you to say you're just going to go bond for something than it is for you to say you're going to engage in this new thing. But I can validate this. I can tell you that they're not in it for the wrong reasons. I can tell you that their solution works. I can give you the reliability of the solution. And that is exactly where WIFA has been placed. We can speak both sides because we're a financing entity and we understand that. We've done financing for 30 years very successfully, but we're also a government entity. We are a state agency that can do that government to government collaboration, that can go to a water provider and say, look, I don't manage infrastructure. I don't need water for any purpose. My only goal is to get you water that you can afford when you need it, where you need it, at the quality that you need it. How do I do that? I kind of get to have that unique role of being that third-party neutral validator that can step in the gap and bridge the two and bring them into the room. And it's not easy. And it's becoming, you would think that kind of with the crisis and the uncertainty that it would get easier, but actually uncertainty makes it a whole lot harder for us to do that. But it is great that I have the flexibility as a state entity and I have the tools as a state entity to be able to have conversations with both sides of the industry and then bring them together to say, this is a solution that we've identified. We've cobbled together the pieces. Maybe it's not a perfect puzzle, but it is a good puzzle that can get you some solutions. I think we're a test case for that. And I'm confident that it's gonna work, but I think that was really the need that was seen. How do we bridge the gap between the public and the private sector? And that's why WIFA is structured the way that it is.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that because I think that was brilliantly said what Chelsea mentioned. And I think it's one of the most difficult challenges that we face right now is that sort of in-between zone between public and private. But I think, again, the relationship building between both is critical. So you have to have some sense of a dynamic quality within your organization to be able to speak both languages. But you also need collaboration and cooperation with other entities. I mean, even being here at this conference is an opportunity to learn from others because there's an education quality about finance that is constantly evolving for a lot of different reasons. There's also an education quality about community and what their needs are and how they communicate now, especially in the tribal areas and the farming areas. We have to actually go there. We have to be in their presence. You know, that's why we always say, like, communities that know. It's like this idea that we're going in to help them, but I think really they're helping us. We should be with them and restoring them. All they need is the capital and the conversations, and I think we would be good to go.
That is a really excellent point. With less than 10 minutes left, I want to turn to the audience and see if anyone has any questions, because at the end, I'm going to offer each one of them an opportunity to say something, you know, mic drop, right? So while they're thinking about what they're going to say mic drop wise, they know the question. I'm going to ask if anybody in the audience has any questions. Oh, here we go.
I have a question for you, Hank. Still learning a little bit more about the role that you play. I do think a lot of larger municipal water utilities see that they have the leverage to go out and help smaller communities with the funding they need. So I'm just wondering your thoughts with, I'll just pick on a utility. I'm not speaking for them, of course. Like, let's just say Houston Public Works. Let's say they've got AAA rating and they've got great leverage and they can go out to the market. You know, some leaders in the space are looking to leverage that to help their communities. Is that a viable model? And if not, assuming they're in a strong position, how can partners such as yourselves sort of fill that gap and help mediate, facilitate that?
It's a great question. And what we find is that there are some large utilities that welcome it with some analysis of kind of what risks they're taking on and that sort of thing. And then there are some that never want to do it at all. You know, they don't want anything to do with it. And yeah, obviously I won't name names, but anytime, as I said, when we work with communities and, you know, to get to some of the earlier points, the critical thing that I think we all agree on you have to start by building a relationship with the community. You can't assume you know what their issues are, and they'll know it in a second unless you're sincerely engaged with them and you're letting them make the decisions, but you're helping them build their capacity. When you work with that community, you look the surrounding area. Is there a larger utility that's close? Have they ever talked to them? Maybe we should broach the subject with them. Are there industries that are, in the region that could be potentially interested in moving to this area if they had confidence in the water infrastructure? So yeah, I think it's all of the above. When you're dealing with communities that have never really been in the system, but have the potential to come together in regional initiatives that could create enough scale to be interesting for funding, you've got to call on all those players. And so hopefully that becomes a bigger deal. Now, part of it is, and I'll stop here just in the interest of time, but part of it is that there have been situations where a larger utility takes on a smaller one and suddenly gets a notice of violation from the environmental agency for violations that predated the acquisition. And so there needs to be clarification. There has to be some kind of safe harbor, for people who are willing to take on those utilities.
I'm going to ask really quick. I might have time for one more question if there was another question. Okay. Gone. I'm going to ask our panelists one last question, and I want to make sure I read it right because I took the time to write it. If there's one thing that you could convey to an audience of water experts, government officials, investors, industry reps, and developers regarding water infrastructure financing, right? And what do we need to do? What would it be? I can start down there.
Sure. So we know we have a problem, and we need to advocate, and we need to talk about it. Federal funding was 7% of overall water infrastructure gap funding relief. It was 7% before IIJA. It upticked a little bit. Historically, it's been as high as 50, 60%. I don't think we should count on getting 50 or 60% federal funding coming back. But we need to recognize that we've got a $3.2 trillion gap over the next 20 years in this country. State and local, they can see their way to about 1.8 billion of that. So we have a gap. We need to advocate around the value of water. I'm not talking about how much we're going to pay for a certain acre foot of water. It's the value of water to the national security of this country, to our communities. The fact that if we had 24 hours without water in this country, it would cost our country $122 billion. There would be 577,000 jobs. We've done research in this area. 577,000 jobs negatively taken away, I guess, not created, removed by 24 hours about water. Where's that going to happen? Healthcare, accommodation, food service. It's not heavy industry. It's not necessarily the data centers. It's core parts of our community would be impacted by this gap. And so knowing that if you invest $1 million in water infrastructure, water O&M, you create $2.6 million of economic output, 1.4 million in GDP gain. We've got to tell that story. We've got to advocate. We've got to talk about the value of water. It's the cornerstone. I don't know if you could have more than one cornerstone for your community, but it's certainly one of them. And I think the fact that all of our state economies are so linked, if we're going to find joint solutions between Arizona and California, the actual research that shows when Arizona invests in Arizona, there's a huge benefit for California. If you're investing in California water, Arizona, our economies are so linked. There's a huge economic uptick over here in Arizona when California works on their water resources. And just getting our community to understand the true value of water and what would happen if we had to go 24 hours without it. The numbers are staggering. We've got to tell the story.
I see from the way people are nodding on the panel that there might be some agreement there, so I'm going to have to go lightning round to the rest of you, right? Air.
All right, I'll be quick here. I mean, John mentioned that we know the problem. We also know the solutions. So all we need is the capital to bring those solutions to life. And we need a diversification of that capital on a lot of different levels to address this problem as a whole.
Awesome. Chelsea.
Best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time to plant it is today. That doesn't mean that if you plant a tree today, that you're going to see a tree tomorrow. So we do need to still have patience within this realm. We do know the solutions. We do know that they're there. We need the capital. We need the political will. We need the cover for our water providers. We need to give them and empower them to do what they need to do to be innovative and creative. And then we need to be patient and understand that we can't say, go do this, and then change our minds the next day when it gets hard.
Excellent. Thank you. Have something to wrap us up?
Those are all great mic drop comments, and I'm going to say something that's probably predictable based on what I've said already, but the community is the starting point. But to me, I think the most important thing for everybody to leave and focus on, in addition to what was just said, is focus on a region. It could be a watershed, but focus on a region and bring the right stakeholders together to understand the situation there, to understand the opportunities there, because that's the place where the connection between investing in water infrastructure and economic growth and opportunity becomes most palpable, where you get the scale where private capital is going to get more interested in it, and where the shared water supply issues, especially in places like Arizona and Texas, are urgent. So focus on the region. Let's get some proof of concept deals and scale from there.
Excellent. And would you all thank our wonderful panelists today? Thank you very much.